PA Books is a production of PCN, a nonprofit television network. Listeners like you make our programming possible. To learn more about PCN's mission and to support PCN with a donation, visit PCNTV.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.
Welcome to the PA Books Podcast. I'm Phil Beckman. PA Books features interviews with authors about Pennsylvania history, culture, and people. In this episode, we talk with Robert Swift about his book, Life, Liberty, and Death on the Appalachian Frontier.
This week on PA Books, Robert Swift, author of Life, Liberty, and Death on the Appalachian Frontier.
Robert Swift is the author of Life, Liberty, and Death on the Appalachian Frontier. Robert, what is it about the frontier that draws your attention?
Part of it is the frontier I'm interested in. It was a period of unknown about what exactly was in the frontier. So you're reading about this, I'm looking at the 18th century, and you're reading accounts of people who, they're on a journey. I write about journeys. And you're not always sure what's over the next mountain range. Plus, I'm finding that this frontier period in Pennsylvania, and this book is Pennsylvania, New York, was a period of turmoil, rapid change, rapid social change, political change, and it was a multicultural frontier in the terms of that there were Native American tribes, trying to deal with white settlers, European settlers, English. Even among them, there was diversity, English, German, 1/3 of the province spoke German, French Huguenots, who fled France because they were Protestant. So you had that kind of turmoil going on. You had a continual westward drive, land speculators, fur traders, going out along the rivers of the area, the region, the Appalachian region, among the trails that were laid down by the Native Americans, often following ridge lines. I live near the Kenoi Path, which connected the Susquehanna with Carlisle. You could still drive along it, and you're on top of a ridge. So that's sort of what's drawn me to this area. We had wars in the thing that really changed the nature of the outcome of essentially a lot of these Native Americans and the white settlers really did not get a chance to coexist together because of wars. Native Americans were driven out of the state. Yeah.
Since you live in this area, do you make an effort to go visit some of the sites that you write about?
Yes, I pretty much, most of the sites I've written about, I've been to. I mean, without one or two exceptions. And that's because I grew up in Western New York. And so as a, young person was very aware of this history, the French at Fort Niagara. I went to school and worked in Western Pennsylvania for 10 years and then came to Harrisburg back in 1979. And I started to see the connections between the regions that today may not be evident to people, but back then, because of waterways of where maybe the fur trade was, we had the French and English trying to get control of the waterways. It was a much more defined region. So that's what made me become aware of it.
So when we go back to this period of the mid-1700s to the late 1700s, what parts of the state would have been considered the frontier?
Basically, the big dividing line was the Blue Mountain Range. And that stretches along from, Easton down to the Pennsylvania-Maryland border. And that was by this point, especially around maybe the 1750s, a lot of Scotch, Irish, and German settlers were, say, in this area around Harrisburg, Cumberland County. But they were sort of beyond the mountain ranges was still Shawnee, Delaware Indians. You had fur traders going out there dealing with beaver skins, deer skins. So they were making contact. The French were coming into Western Pennsylvania down the Ohio River Valley system. But so in this case, the frontier would have been north of, in Eastern Pennsylvania, Allentown was just a small town. It would have been the Poconos back then. At Sunbury, Forks of the Susquehanna River was a Native American village that was mainly people who had been pushed out of places further east, as William Penn started buying land in the late 1680s,
Talk a little bit more about that. You write in the book about the Delaware and where they were at the time that the Europeans arrived, and then their movements across the state.
The Delaware were when first it was the Swiss and the Dutch dealing with the Delaware. They were basically along the Delaware River. Sometimes they were called Unamis or Minisink, different names for them. When William Penn came here, he had a policy of buying land from them. Now, one of the problems here was that the concept of a white settler for land and for Native Americans was different. So they weren't always sure when they were getting into when they were selling their land. They were seasonal migrations, sometimes between rivers in the interior. They didn't want to be around the river in the winter. They weren't used to people fencing in land, and they were used to going on hunting expeditions. So that complicated these land sales that Penn handled. But as a result, the Delaware were continually being pushed westward. As more settlers came in, they found the game was scarce, so they were going west. As I said before, the village of Shamokin, Sunbury by the 1720s was a major center. It was a 12 trails radiated from that place, the forks of the Susquehanna. And that's where and it wasn't just the Delaware, it was the Tutaloo tribe, Kanoi. It was a mix of different Indian tribes located there by then. The Penn family, even after he was gone, I know that one of their agents, James Logan, he wanted to, there were a lot of Scotch-Irish coming in. And he said, well, I want to settle them on the frontier as a buffer both against the Native Americans, and he was concerned about the French even at that point. So when you look Lancaster County, you're looking at Donegal, Derry, in that area. Those were all settlements that James Logan encouraged on the edge of the frontier.
So talk more about the Scots-Irish. How did they end up migrating to Pennsylvania?
They were, so this is one of England's, you might say, first colonial ventures. They were lowland Scots, and they were starting to migrate to Ulster. This is Northern Ireland. Back, after the Battle of the Boyne, 1688, and all that. And they were, once again, it was economic, better land there. But the situation, the Scotch-Irish always struggled with not being able to own any land, always were paying rent. And so they were like quick to, when the migration started to Pennsylvania, they decided to go. And once again, they were looking for land to own. And they considered, there's one phrase that they call southeast Pennsylvania, the best poor man's country. So you could get land, and you could, you had these limestone springs here in the farmland. The soil was very good. They also, herded sheep and cattle. So there was a natural incentive for them to come to this area.
Now, you write in the book about their tendency to build churches at these limestone springs. Why were they doing that?
Well, first of all, the churches were Presbyterian faith, and that was a driving force for them. When I started writing about this period in time, I became aware how important religion was to the whole century. So the Scotch-Irish, one of the reasons you can go see these churches today. Silver Spring is one right off of Route 11 near Mechanicsburg. You walk back, there is a spring still. It's still there. But that was a place people might have been traveling, for up to 5 or 10 miles to come to church. And there was water for the horses and water for them. So that's one reason they were picking springs to build their church by. And most of the time, these first churches were log structures. Well, now you go to them, and now there's stone. They're built like they will last forever. And you see them today, and they're beautiful architecture. But early on, we were talking about log structure, basically.
Now, another Native American people who were influential in Pennsylvania were the Iroquois, the Confederacy. Yes. What role did they play, say, in the relationships with the Delaware?
They were basically the Iroquois by the 18th century. Their nearest competitors were the Catawba Indians down in the southern Appalachians. They had sort of pushed out all the other nearby tribes, and they had formed a confederacy of 5 nations extending from the Mohawk Valley to Niagara Falls area. They viewed the Delaware as like a minor league ally, and what they were interested in was having some of these tribes that were being pushed out of like southeast Pennsylvania, like the Delaware, and having them settle in north central Pennsylvania along the Susquehanna River, both branches, as a buffer zone. They would have influence over them, and they oftentimes directed them where to settle. But they weren't. The tribes still had some autonomy, but this became. There were clashes when the Iroquois were sometimes directing the Delaware to sell land they didn't really want to sell, but they were the stronger military. But basically, they viewed the Delaware as a buffer zone, and also there was continual problems in this period where the Iroquois and the Catawba would get involved in long-distance wars. We have what's now called warrior paths in the state, trails that they both went on, and sometimes, white settlers in the backcountry of Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania got caught up in these wars, or the Delaware would get involved in them too. So it was a period of a lot of violent struggle going on.
How important was the relationship between Pennsylvania and the Iroquois?
That's very important, because the Pennsylvania basis, after William Penn is gone now, we're talking here about the 1720s, late 1720s, 1730s. Pennsylvania, they don't want to have the brothers of, or the sons of William Penn, Thomas Penn, they don't want to have to deal with a whole bunch of tribes. And they could, form an alliance with the Iroquois and continue with these land sales and things like that, and just deal with them. And that is why, in some of the cases, the Iroquois sent an agent, basically, his name was Shikellamy, to live at Shamokin and sort of handle affairs. And Pennsylvania had a diplomat named Conrad Weiser, who had grown up among the Mohawk in New York State. And he was a German, but he knew the language, and he became Pennsylvania's chief diplomat. And for 30 years, about Shikellamy and Weiser were the duo traveling back and forth, basically between Philadelphia, which was Pennsylvania's capital, and Onondaga, which is near Syracuse, New York, which was the Iroquois capital, was where they, among the Confederacy there, where they picked their spot where they would meet, to this situations if there was a threat of war or some other disturbance going on. Pennsylvania and the Iroquois for 30 years had this sort of alliance, special even beyond the anything that Britain had with the Iroquois, that served them both.
Now, you write about the trail between Philadelphia and Onondaga. Was that a well-defined trail?
All these trails, there's a tendency for us to think there's one path, and I've been on most of that trail, and there's certain parts where it is defined, and there's other parts where it's sort of hard to follow. But basically, the part of the trail in Pennsylvania that's important started at Conrad Weiser's homestead, which is now a state historical site, near Reading, and it sort of started there, and it took advantage of, it went on a northwest direction to Shamokin, and it took advantage of going through mountain gaps and along ridges again to try to let the geography work for you. And from Shamokin, it was sort of following the, coming up through Lycoming Creek near Williamsport, and going up central to New York up to Onondaga. Hitting parts of the Susquehanna Valley along the way. So in a sense, it was a defined trail, but it wasn't, obviously wasn't paved. There's still, there's a spring to this day called Pilgrim's Rest. It's on a mountain north of Reading along the Blue Mountains. That was a stopping point for travelers on that trail, and there's still a spring there.
One of the stories that you tell in the book is Conrad Weiser and Shikellamy were on a journey in 1737. You called it a harrowing journey.
Yeah.
What happened?
They set out, once again, it was deemed urgent for them to try to get up to Onondaga. There was a threat of war breaking out on the southern frontier, and a lot of times, sometimes Virginia and Maryland governors getting, hey, can you help us out here? We don't we wanted warfare on our border, and they set out. What turned out the winters back then, you're talking what was called the Little Ice Age. So the winters were much more severe than what we know today. But they set out, and nevertheless, and it got serious for them because they were at one point trying to cross Lycoming Creek, and Shikellamy fell and was just narrowly saved when a branch he had a pack on caught him. The problem they were also facing was for these Native American villages. Typically, if they could arrive at one, the hospitality rules of the Delaware were that they would feed guests. But oftentimes by late winter, we're talking February here, they were running out of food. The hunting season was gone. Maybe the food that they had saved up from the fall harvest was getting low. Many times they were relying on maple sap from maple trees to get by, or they could find berries. And there was a famine going on in these villages along there. So they were Shikellamy and Weiser were low on food. And at one point, Weiser didn't think he could go on anymore. He was getting weak. And Shikellamy sort of got him to his feet to keep on pressing ahead. But there's many cases where they're setting, I've read about these Moravian missionaries setting out in wintertime to go someplace and getting having trouble crossing a stream because of ice floods, that sort of thing. Today, people would think twice about doing it, but they were hardy back then, and they would set out, Yeah.
Well, you mentioned the Moravians. Of course, one of the key figures there was Count Zinzendorf.
Yeah.
Who was he?
He was a Moravian church leader. He was from Saxony, I think that's where they were all from, Bohemia in Central Europe. So he came over, was instrumental in founding Bethlehem, but he was also one who was making these journeys into the wilderness, up to Onondaga, other places. The Moravians were interesting. I found them interesting that they were trying to, they had this idea they were going to convert the Native Americans and sort of relocate them into these Christian settlements, like houses with, made of logs and sometimes window panes. And they would have what they call Levfest, giving bread and butter and chocolate milk to. And they kept extensive journals, and that's why if you're trying to read about the area, this period, you tend to look at the missionary journals because they were the best educated. Now, in the Moravians' case, they were written in German, so I didn't read the original German. I've relied on the labors of others over the decades who've translated them. But one reason I would sort of write about it because they're giving the best description of what's going on out there. Once again, through a white man's eye. It's not like you have to be a little bit careful when even someone like Conrad Weiser describing, he was often an interpreter, and he was briefly a Moravian, but he still has his own vantage point or prejudice of what he's looking at. So for Native Americans, it's still trying to divine what they really were saying or thinking is sometimes difficult. But we still have to go on these written accounts for that period.
Now, we've talked about Conrad Weiser a few times, and he was one of a number of frontier traders and diplomats who were go-betweens, often people like Andrew Montour, Christopher Gist. When you read about these people, what does that show you about frontier life?
These are people who were actually comfortable in both worlds. So Gist was someone who was obviously an agent for the Ohio Company at one point. He accompanied George Washington on a diplomatic journey to a French fort, LeBoeuf, in western Pennsylvania, because he wanted someone who had the skills to survive. One thing about Gist, and as I read about him and his son Thomas, I call it an eye for land. Because these people are, and I sometimes wonder, they're going along in the wintertime sometimes describing they're in the middle of nowhere basically, talking about what the land and the trees were like and what trees were out there and the soil looked good. And I'm not sure if they wrote the journal when they were passing through or they wrote it a few months later, but it's very detailed descriptions of basically wilderness. But today, you're seeing farmland there. And Washington was the same way, George Washington, doing the same thing. So they were, I call them like, they're go-betweens because they could just could report back to the Virginia governor, be at home in Williamsburg, but he also had what they call a plantation. Now, their term for plantation is not the southern, they use that frequently. It's not the southern style plantation. It's meant anything like a homestead they had. He had one out near Pittsburgh.
Now, you mentioned that he went on a mission with George Washington to Fort Le Boeuf.
Yeah.
What was that mission about?
At this point, starting about 1753, the French were established. They had colonies in Canada and Louisiana, and they were. They also had sort of control of the Great Lakes as water routes, but they wanted to link the two colonies together more. They were also aware that the English population in English colonies, west of the Blue Mountain Range or east of the Blue Mountain Range, was increasing, and they were worried that they didn't have the same numbers of French in Canada. So they were worried about eventually that, and this is what happened, that the English were going to just outnumber them and push them away. So they sent an armed force down from Fort Niagara, which is where the Niagara River meets Lake Ontario, where they had a fort. And they landed at Presque Isle, which is now not modern Erie, and they sort of hacked out a road. And when I say a road, a rough road, they would put logs down, and it's very marshy up in that part of the state, to try to get down there. And they were using French Creek as a waterway, a tributary. And so the English obviously were aware of that the French were making the moves. In this case, Virginia had land interest claims in this area as well as Pennsylvania. So as Governor Dinwiddie in Virginia, sending Washington, a young, he's 22 years old, around early 20s. They send Christopher Gist with him because he knows the backwoods, to deliver a note to the French commander to get out, whatever good that was going to do. And this was one of these classic journeys that Washington wrote about. They were entertained by the French one night with a lot of brandy, Washington writes. But they were also told, no, this is our land, you better return back to your governor, saying we're not leaving. And they, on the return journey, they had adventures. Indian took a shot at them and missed. They got wet in the Allegheny River one night and spent a cold night on an island around where Pittsburgh is now. So it was a very eventful journey. And that's what, so ultimately it was the French-Indian War that drove the French out from that area.
Now, we talked about Fort Le Boeuf, and they did build a series of forts along the Allegheny River down to the forks of the Ohio. How did the French see this area from a strategic point of view?
They're once again, they're looking at, this is why I focus a lot on waterways. And they're focused on we're talking about once again, I look at the Niagara River as sort of a key choke point between Lake Ontario, Lake Erie, and that's how you get your forces down, by going through that, going around the falls on land. And then the Ohio, we're talking here, the Ohio River system, we're talking, Allegheny River, the Ohio River has formed at Pittsburgh, Monongahela River, and they were using that as the waterways to put the forts on. That's how, and were sending expeditions into the Ohio country in that period, which was a vast region. Most people did not know the extent of it. The English were just starting at that point to send people, like Cameron Weiser made a couple of journeys out to what they call Logstown, which is in the Beaver Creek, where there was a major Indian settlement. They were competing for the fur trade, which was lucrative. And as the supply of pelts became depleted in the east, the Schuylkill River, say where it started, they were constantly striking out west. And both the French and British were competing for that trade. And they both recognized that the Ohio was the key to the future at that point.
So this competition would eventually lead to the French and Indian War.
That's right, yes.
And Pennsylvania will play a very significant role in that just because of the location. Some of the figures there would be people like General Forbes, who would attempt to build a road out west. What was his role during the campaign?
He was learning. He learned from the mistakes of his predecessor, General Edward Braddock, who in 1755 had sent a British army out there, and they cut a road, Braddock's Road, which actually went through Maryland and the southwest corner of Pennsylvania. But Braddock was not. He didn't take enough care to have enough Native American allies with him. He was arrogant and sort of drove some of them away. He also did not. He sort of blundered into an ambush and paid for it with his life. It was a disaster. So and that led to a wave of attacks by the Delaware, who threw a lot in with the French at that point, and the Shawnee Indians against settlements, in Carlisle, even, in this area here, they were raiding along Paxton area. So when it came time when the British decided, okay, by 1758, they're on a new campaign to sort of oust the French from what's called the Forks of the Ohio at modern Pittsburgh. They had a Fort Duquesne, and Forbes decided to do it methodically. And so he was going to, he started in Carlisle, and he built a series of forts and camps that his army would march, and they would build a fort. One was at the Juniata River, Juniata Crossing, and he would advance by stages. He had like 6,000 men. And the same time, he was trying to make peace with the eastern Indians, the Delaware, who lived in the eastern areas. And he had an emissary, a Moravian missionary named Post, who was going out there and keeping Forbes apprised of, what was going on. And they actually had they called a Treaty of Easton in October 1758, where they struck a deal with these eastern, to seek peace with the eastern Delaware. And that gave Forbes his army, which was at Fort Ligonier by then. And so they were already well out there. That was a big help in deciding to continue. They had one setback where an advance guard got ambushed, but from that, they picked up some French prisoners who told them there weren't that many French troops in Fort Duquesne. And even though it was getting late, we were talking November here, Forbes pushed on, and the French evacuated the fort, blew it up. And then they evacuated the other forts in the Allegheny River, Fort LeBoeuf, Fort Bouchot. So by 1758, the British had control of the Forks of the Ohio. They spent the next 2 years moving up to take control of those forts in the Allegheny. Forbes is a very interesting situation. He is not well during most of this. And you just today you sort of figure, well, how the hell did he do this? How did he pull this off? He's often be carried on a litter. And so as soon as they win control there, he's headed back. And he's corresponding with people saying, I need to get medical help. And there's points where he's weak, can't move. Other times he rallies. He gets back to Philadelphia and he's dead within 2 months. And some people think it might be stomach cancer, modern historians looking at this. So he leaves his legacy in many place names in the Pittsburgh area. He's buried in Philadelphia, in a church there. But most people who do not, Pennsylvanians don't really know who he is.
We'll be back in a moment with the PA Books Podcast.
Enjoying this podcast? Please support PCN with a donation at pcntv.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.
Now, some of the actors during this period were the Cherokee, who sent, even though they were from the southern area, they did have warriors who came up and participated in this campaign. What was their role? I
find this to be interesting because they were a major, population, I think of around 10,000. They could field a lot of warriors. We had a lot of warfare going down in the southern frontier during this period. Wars between England and Spain and Georgia. We had wars going on with native tribes in Tennessee and North Carolina. So the Cherokee were, the British had cultivated them. And actually some Cherokee had actually visited London, leaders. And so they, in 1757, they were like getting them to come north and sort of take part in the campaigns against the French. There were some pro-French Cherokee that were still there, but these were alliances that were created, and things did not work out well. The Cherokee themselves were sometimes some of the backcountry settlers were suspicious of them. There were complaints about horse stealing, that sort of thing. The Cherokee didn't. They weren't used to Ford's methodical campaign. Take your time. They were more used to the hit and run fighting. They did some of that, but there weren't many. A lot of them just went home. They felt that they weren't often justly compensated in presence. They weren't able to be out there hunting to keep their family supplied with food when they were up here. And eventually, within about 2 years after Fort Duquesne fell, the British and the Cherokee were fighting each other down, in the Cherokee's homeland. And I just find that to be, the Cherokee picked a time to fight the British when the French were already defeated. That wasn't good timing for them. They could have lost a potentially strong ally. And the British, you wonder how I just find out how you went from an alliance like that to warfare. And some of the people who were on the Forbes campaign were down there fighting the Cherokee 2 years later. So.
Now, another group of people that you write about are the Palatine Germans. And where's the Palatinate, and what motivated them to migrate?
They're basically the Rhineland. They are, and what was going on, we don't think about this much in this country, but there was what was called the 30 Years' War in 17th century Europe. And it was between the Catholic and the newly emerging Protestant nations. And Germany, which was at that time was a collection of principalities and duchies and things like that, was ground zero for the battleground. And so the Palatines were, repeated invasions of their land, losing their land, sometimes Spanish troops in there. Queen Anne of Great Britain offered them refuge in Britain, fellow Protestants, and they went there, but there was a tenuous existence there, and the Palatines were often facing that. They migrated to New York, and they had one scheme where they were going to employ them making tar, because the British Navy needed tar to caulk the ships. And they were always, the Palatines, even in New York, never had land title. It was hard for them to get ahead. And they, in 1723, Pennsylvania Governor William Keith had been up in Albany. And there were, at this time, there were different conferences going on between New York, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia. So they would meet together, the governors. He invited the Palatine group to come down to settle in the Tuppahawken Valley of Pennsylvania, which is near Reading, Berks County, and they went on a journey. They built rafts and went on a journey down the Susquehanna River, down to Swatara Creek at Middletown, and then went up Swatara Creek to get close to. Then they sort of portaged around land to reach the valley, and there's not a lot of detail. We don't know. We can't tell you exactly what day they passed, but there's references to them coming down, and Conrad Weiser, who actually knew them, but didn't come down. He came down 6 years later. He wrote about them, about the journey. That's one of our sources. And so once again, though, when they get to the Tuppahawken Valley, these are industrious farmers. Once again, they're God-fearing people. But once again, they're in an area where they don't have clear title because the Delaware hadn't really ceded that land yet. And so so when the French-Indian War broke out, they're being raided by Delaware coming over from the Blue Mountain into this valley. Now, eventually, they are still there today, their descendants, and there's still great farm country, and they're carrying on their traditions.
Another figure that you write about was Joseph Simon. Who was he?
He was a Jewish merchant based in Lancaster who became one of the major, when I say he was a fur trader, he was actually a major, owned companies. He was sort of a middleman. He had warehouses. He fronted the money for the individual fur traders to go out to western Pennsylvania. He actually went out himself. So he was an unusual person on the frontier, but he was also, at home at the businesses of Philadelphia too. He's buried in Lancaster County in a Jewish cemetery, which is the fourth oldest Jewish cemetery in the United States. And he had other partners in the fur trade too, which was a major. We sort of don't think of it today, but it was a major source of wealth and revenue coming out of Pennsylvania at that time.
Now, we talked about the French Indian War a little bit. After that comes the American Revolution. How does the Revolution impact the relationship between Pennsylvania and, say, the Iroquois?
That was initially, but the British, at the end of the French Indian War, had gone to great lengths to try to keep the Iroquois on their side. There had been one rebellion called Pontiac's War right around 1763, and which mainly occurred in western Pennsylvania, where once again Delaware and tribes from the west and were trying to push the British back across the mountains. The Iroquois, the Seneca and the western tribe, the western Niagara frontier, they joined that, and they actually attacked the British supply wagon train along the Niagara Gorge and threw them over the cliff at a place called Devil's Hole today. The British Indian agent they had two agents. One was William Johnson for the northern Indians, and there was a man named Atkin down for the southern one. Johnson was a master negotiator with them. He was married to a Mohawk woman, Molly Brant. He did his. He was very skilled at keeping the Iroquois pro-British. Now, as the tensions mounted at the start of the Revolution, 1773 Tea Party, 1774, Johnson was really engaged in keeping the Iroquois loyal to the crown and not to the revolutionaries. Yet he dies at a council in 1774 in the middle of a speech. He got ill and died. And initially, when the revolution started, the Iroquois were somewhat wanted to be neutral, but by this time, both American agents and Johnson's son-in-law, were going to the different nations, trying to get them on each side. The Americans eventually, the Oneida, firmly allied with them. The British had the Seneca. A few others, like the Cayuga, were divided. The Iroquois, though, were being employed by the British by like 1777. They were starting to raid the Pennsylvania frontier. And we're talking here the Wyoming Valley, where Wilkes-Barre is today. And the Americans were relying on food from those areas to keep, Washington's army supplied. British at that point, they occupied Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. And so these raids coming into northern Pennsylvania were a serious threat to the Americans. And there was one, what you call it, the Wyoming Valley Massacre, where an Iroquois force, always with British soldiers, had wiped out a fort. And the survivors had to flee through forests and swamps to get back to the American lines. So in 1779, Washington sent an army up under General John Sullivan to go invade this would have been the Seneca homeland mainly, the Genesee Valley, coming up through Pennsylvania. And they had one battle just across north of the Pennsylvania border at Newton, defeated the Native American force. And essentially it was a plunder campaign where they destroyed about 40 villages in the Genesee River area, burn crops in September, cut down orchards. Many times by this time, the Iroquois were living in, frame houses, burning them. The remnant Iroquois fled to Fort Niagara. Sullivan, it's like mid-October. He says, I'm fur enough. I'm done here. I'm not going to go the whole way. It's going to be winter soon, and I don't want to get extended. Washington gets the name Town Destroyer from the Iroquois as a result, and that sort of, in a way, broke the Iroquois power. That campaign, they were still doing raids after that, but they didn't have the same force that they did before Sullivan.
Now, one of the Iroquois nations, the Tuscarora, originated down in the Carolinas area.
Yes.
How did they end up migrating north?
This was, they were what was considered, I think it was the Algonquin stock, distantly related to the Iroquois. And the Tuscarora in North Carolina were facing their own pressures from white settlers in North Carolina, which was leading to war, and they were being pushed out, basically. And the Iroquois invited them to resettle. Once again, the Iroquois, Tuscarora would be another buffer nation, in southern New York, northern Pennsylvania. And so the the Tuscarora started migrating. Now, it's interesting to note this migration took around 60 years. It didn't happen all at once. Different groups were going up the river, maybe establishing villages for a while, for maybe 4 or 5 years, and moving north. They ended up going up to what's called the Niagara Escarpment region, just south of Fort Niagara there. But what was happening, they left their name here in Pennsylvania. Tuscarora Mountain is named for them. We have Tuscarora creeks around here. We have the Path Valley in Franklin County, which was a pathway, ancient pathway, where they were taking that path to come around Fort Loudon. And there's journals of them, the Moravians, telling about their arrival. A group of 60 arrived today, and we gave them food and canoes, and they stayed a while, then headed north. So this was, once again, a long migration. Another tribe, the Nanacoke, were in the same situation in Maryland. And they had the same pressures from white settlers, and they also were migrating at about the same time. And they ended up, Nanacoke, Pennsylvania is where their place name is. I was at a village in Lancaster County, site of a village. Today it's still called, the place called Indian Run. There's a plaque there.
You also write about Barnabas Hughes and the founding of Elizabethtown. Who was it named after?
It was named after his wife, Elizabeth. So they were both, the date that it was founded was 1763. And, we're here at the end of the French and Indian War. And you start looking around this area, there's a lot of towns formed, little towns around 1763, 65. Gee, peace has come, And so it's not a coincidence that, people are starting to, oftentimes these towns, a tavern was there. He had one called the Sign of the Bear. And it's still there, but it's hard to recognize it. It's now an office building, but they have a little model of what it looked like. And Hughes was interesting because he was what they call a settler or a commissary to the British armies. As the British, during the French and Indian War, the British needed tons of material to especially Forbes, they needed hay for horses, forage they called it. They needed blacksmith supplies and wagons. And so they were turning to him to supply these goods. Meantime, his tavern is a stopping point for soldiers. And later on, as he becomes wealthy, they're founding a town. They're laying out lots, selling land to settlers, and we have Elizabethtown today.
We talked a little bit about the Seneca, and one of the key figures later on during this period was Corn Planter. Who was he?
Corn Planter was a Seneca leader. He was born in the Genesee River area, and I've actually been to the site. He was, in the Revolution, he was pro-British, and he was on some of the raids coming into northern Pennsylvania. But by the end of the Revolution, he led a band of Seneca. They became known as the Allegheny Seneca, and they were based along the Allegheny River in northwest Pennsylvania and southern New York. And there was a period there where he allied with the Americans, and he actually traveled to Philadelphia to meet with Washington, which was where the first United States capital was in the 1790s. And he was among a number of Native American leaders who was doing this, and he helped negotiate with tribes in the Ohio who were the American Army at that time was fighting off and on with as a reward. Now it's interesting because the General Assembly awarded him land tracts. So this is a white man's political body. Oh, you can have this land. So it was once the Seneca land, all of it. So he had 3 tracts of land, and one was called Corn Planter Tract, and this is right below the border of with New York. And so he lived to be in his old age. He lived long enough to see a steamboat on the Allegheny. He realized that his people needed to, for the Seneca after Revolution, it was quite an adjustment, especially for the men, because the hunting culture fur trading culture was ending, and they were having to adjust to agriculture, which had been the job of Seneca women. So they were trying to adjust to that. But Corn Planter welcomed Quaker missionaries to come out to his tract and teach farming methods. They built a sawmill there. He still had his, when I say he was pro-American, he still resented them a lot. So he still wasn't, he still resented the loss of the land. So his settlement there, his descendants were living there into 1964, when the United States government used eminent domain to take their land to build the Kinsawah Reservoir as a flood storage and recreation project. And they have just a little bit of the tract is left there. Corn Planter's grave which was paid for by the state of Pennsylvania, a monument in 1866 was moved to higher ground. This was another issue with the Tuscarora had lost land too for a project, a reservoir with the Niagara Power Project in the late 50s. And they felt they had treaties guaranteeing this land from the time of the Revolution. So to them, it still stings the loss of that land. And that's why Corn Planter, I think he's remembered today because of that long fight over what happened to his land.
Now, you had mentioned that the Seneca, that women in the Seneca communities were the ones who did agriculture. Yeah. The Seneca were a matrilineal society. Can you talk about the relationship between men and women? Yeah,
it was interesting. Some people said the Seneca woman and the men were often identified with what tools did you use? So the women were used, the men were going hunting, and they were basically doing the tools to do in the gardens that were quite bountiful by any description that soldiers of Sullivan's army were amazed at the volume of the corn and squash and bean crops that were being. They were also doing the orchards. They were also tapping maple sugar trees in the March for syrup. So their roles were established, and they also, through their matrilineal culture, the Iroquois men, when they would marry, would sort of become identified with the wife's mother's family, would move in with them for a while. They also exerted a role in the councils. While you would have a corn planter there we would have maybe in New York a red jacket. Oftentimes, the Iroquois woman would exert. They wouldn't speak before the council, but they would make their wishes known, and the men would carry them out. They exerted a lot of political power behind the scenes, and we have some Quakers writing about this, witnessing this at some of the treaties, where they were had a lot of political power. But it wasn't like I said, they weren't at the table, but they were behind the table, and they were listened to.
Who was Handsome Lake?
He was a brother of a corn planter, once again born in the Genesee region, and he became a founder of a new religion. And this was once again for the Native Americans, especially after the Revolution. Their society was in trouble. They had lost a lot of their land. They were in New York State, at least. They were down their reservations. They were having problems with alcohol, idleness, especially with the men trying to adjust. And Handsome Lake, at one point, went into sort of a coma, trance is the way, or once again, we're relying on the Quaker missionaries who witnessed this to sort of describe what happened. And they thought he had died. And then they felt Chainbreaker, another of the corn planter, Seneca, described in his memoirs to white men again of feeling a warm spot on Handsome Lake's chest and them coming back to life. And then he'd seen a vision, and he's describing with the Seneca what they must do to reclaim their culture and society. And a lot of it was swearing off alcohol and stuff like that. But it became a major religion within the Seneca. Now, there was, even into the early 19th century, in the Iroquois villages, Seneca villages, you had Senecas who become Christianized. You had the Handsome Lake followers, and you had what they call pagans, still believed in the ancient religion. So you had religious disputes going on, but the Handsome Lake is buried up at Onondaga. He fell ill there, I think it was 1815, and is buried there. But so I think it's interesting to him because we could sort of see this new religion being founded here, and it's a place you wouldn't expect it to happen, but it did. And we have accounts of the beginning of it.
Now, one of the figures you write about is Rachel Cope, and she wrote about her journeys in some of these areas. What did she describe?
She described, first of all, she stayed at the Barnabas Hughes Tavern. She mentioned that in one of her journals. But she kept a journal of going there and going up the Susquehanna River, then crossing over northern Pennsylvania with her husband, and then eventually meeting corn planter. And her job was trying to teach sewing and knitting to the Seneca women. The Quakers also established a school at Tunessa, which lasted into the 19th century. They were her husband and others were bringing in plows for plowing land, working with the sawmill. Hers is a tragic story. I mean, she died in childbirth, but we have her journals. These are educated people, these missionaries going out there, men and women. When they went out, they were very descriptive in their describing scenery, describing the culture they found.
Now, another figure is Kanasa Tego.
Yes, he was. He's interesting in the sense that he was based in Onondaga, and he was one of the, as the Pennsylvania was trying to forge links with the Iroquois, he became an important figure for them. So Commander Weiser is traveling up there to meet him. He came down to Pennsylvania for a major conference in Lancaster in 1744. And this is where Pennsylvania was starting to look to the west, and they were trying to look to how can we make some ties with the Native Americans living in Ohio. And he made a major speech there. There's quite a description of him arriving in town. He also was lecturing the Pennsylvanians on the benefits of a United Confederacy, which the Iroquois had. And there's always been some speculation about how much people like Benjamin Franklin, who borrowed from the Iroquois government, federalist structure in their Confederacy to create the United States.
When you look back at over the centuries at this period, the frontier activity, what do you think? What kind of big picture view do you take of that time period?
To me, it was like I think there was an opportunity for the Pennsylvania to have been more of a multicultural society, and it didn't happen, and it was because of two wars intervened. By what I mean was that there was a point at which, maybe around before the French-Indian War, where it's possible that some of the Native American towns like Shamokin could have developed into more lasting communities, starting with the Moravians. And you can argue about whether they should have been Christianizing Indians and creating settlements for them or not. But these settlements did not survive the two wars. They were like in a no man's land. They weren't trusted by anybody. And these settlements did not last, and especially in Pennsylvania. So the idea that there might have been a large city in the Lehigh Valley area into the 19th century with Native Americans living here, descendants, didn't happen. And I think later on we became a multicultural society with the mass immigration from Europe in the late 19th century. But that was, still European. But the irony is that when William Penn he wanted to buy the land fairly from the Native Americans, what he considered fairly. What are the land concepts got in the way of that? But I think he thought that Native Americans were going to stay here. Penn wanted to have a second city in the Susquehanna, but I think he envisioned them as being part of his Commonwealth. And he was, of course, in the name of religious freedom, inviting people like the Mennonites to settle here. But the wars killed that idea. And today, so Pennsylvania, we don't have the people, Native Americans who were living there, and at least in the formal structure, were pushed down. Now, people are still, Native Americans are still living here, and they'll be happy to tell you that quickly. They never left, they say, just descendants. But like in New York State, they did have reservations to this day, whether they were good or bad. In Pennsylvania, which started out under Penn's vision, they were pushed out of here. They were dispossessed of their land, except in a few cases where the General Assembly gave land grants, and then even in that case, the federal government took the land away. And to me, that's a tragedy.
Well, we've been speaking with Robert Swift. He is the author of Life, Liberty, and Death on the Appalachian Frontier. Robert, thanks for joining me.
Thank you.
Listeners like you make PCN programming possible. Full episodes of PA Books, as well as other PCN programs, are available to stream with the PCN Select app. To learn more about PCN's mission and to support PCN with a donation, visit pcntv.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.